In the last 27 years, we have invited nearly 60 nationally and internationally renowned speakers from a wide variety of disciplines and professions to speak on the general topic of how Christian faith relates to their particular intellectual discipline or sphere of interest. Tonight's speaker, Professor Marilynne Robinson, is no exception. We're looking forward to the visit next spring of philosopher Alvin Plantinga from Notre Dame on March 26 and 27, and screenwriter Paul Schrader in September, and to be followed by Yale historian Harry Stout, actually an authority on Puritanism, in October of next year. It is our hope to reschedule bioethicist Dr. Edmund Pellegrino of Georgetown University, who was to have come in October. But we hope that we could reschedule him for next February or April. So please stay tuned. I want to express our sincere appreciation to the Department of English and the Department of Religious Studies and the numerous churches in Iowa City and Coralville, as well as campus ministries, for their generous support of tonight's lecture. It has been our tradition in the past 7 years to use the occasion of the Fall Geneva Lecture to present the annual Faith and Learning Award to a past or present member of the University of Iowa who has demonstrated that the life of the mind is an important context for the service of God. This year's recipient, our seventh, Dr. Jordy Lowry, was nominated by Kevin Coomer, a member of our committee, who will now come out to introduce him.
My wife Maria and I nominated Jordy after 6.5 years of acquaintance with him in a lot of different contexts. But I simply want to read the nomination that we wrote on behalf of him tonight. There's too much to say in a short time. Dr. George V. Jordy Lowry, professor of internal medicine and rheumatology, is an impressive man who lives out his faith in each of life's contexts. He is an energetic doctor with a deep compassion for his patients, skilled both in giving medical treatment and in caring for people humanly. He's an excellent and creative teacher, a role that he loves, and one of the most popular instructors in the medical school, regularly being chosen by senior classes as their commencement speaker. In addition, Jordy has made himself available to the Christian and wider student community via the Christian Medical Association, telling his faith and learning story and offering his assistance in helping others in their faith learning journey. He is an active member of New Life Community Church and the committed husband of Judy and father of Megan and Molly. He's an encouraging friend, and perhaps most impressive of all is his childlike enthusiasm and love for Christ and his eagerness to learn more of what it means to know and follow him. So it's a privilege and an honor to know and to nominate Dr. Jordy Lowry.
Since it's too far for you to see what's written, I'm going to read most of it to you. The Geneva Lecture Committee at the University of Iowa is honored to present the 7th Annual Faith and Learning Award to George V. Jordy Lowry, MD, in recognition of his contribution to the task of integrating faith and learning, November 14th, 2003.
Thank you. Thank you very much. When I first came to Iowa about 10 years ago with the flood, I wasn't certain that being employed at a state university, I would need to sort of leave my faith at the door. And the Lord showed me over the ensuing years that nothing was further from the truth and nothing was further from what he had in mind. I feel very grateful for being here. I've loved my 10 years at Iowa. I felt very encouraged by other Christians here as well, and I certainly feel encouraged tonight. And I hope we can all be an encouragement to one another in the lives of those all around us, because we all have the promise that Jesus will complete in us the work he has begun. Thank you very much.
We're honored to have with us this evening Professor James McPherson, my friend and neighbor, Pulitzer Prize winner, and an esteemed colleague of Marilynne's in the Writers' Workshop, who will introduce her. Dr. Robinson has agreed to also do a Q&A after she speaks. So I will now invite my friend, James McPherson, to come up.
I came to the Writers' Workshop in 1981, and Marilynne Robinson came in 1991. We've been colleagues since then. During those, one semester during those first years, a student in the workshop asked if I would conduct an independent study with him in religion. And so I agreed. Then a friend of his wanted to join us, and I agreed. And then some other people wanted to join us. And I finally put a list on the bulletin board and asked those who were interested to sign up. And a massive number of workshop students, both poets and fiction writers, signed up. And then Marilynne agreed to teach the course with me. And so we began. We had faculty members in there. We had all kinds of people from outside. And during that semester, Marilynne taught me so much. And I've always been grateful to her for her learned approach to the matters of faith. She's a good colleague. I've got all these things about Marilynne to say, but I'll keep it short. She was born in Sandpoint, Idaho. I won't tell how old you are. But she graduated from Brown University in 1966. Then she studied religion and creative writing, and then she taught for a year in France. Then did graduate work at the University of Washington, and she began her novel Housekeeping. She received a PhD in Shakespeare, a book on Henry V, published a novel in 1981 and received the PEN Hemingway Award, nominated for Pulitzer Prize. She taught at the University of Kent in England at Amherst College. The University of Massachusetts in 1989 published Mother Country, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. She has written essays for Harper's and other magazines, and she published The Death of Adam in 1998. I'm very proud to say that she is as sturdy a friend as she is an excellent teacher. And that's not just my opinion. I happened to run a check on her. And I want to read something that a young high school English major wrote after researching Marilynne's life and after reading her work. She said, Robinson's high school Latin teacher introduced a whole new world of literature to her, a world that was of olden times, full of authors like Horace, Virgil, and Cicero. These great authors from the Maroon era helped to mold the style of Robinson. The Western education that she received when she was young has set her apart from other contemporary authors. Robinson's main influence in her writing has been the transcendentalist of the 19th century. She doesn't write fiction just to write a book. She writes on a subject that moves her in some form. In her writing, Robinson considers analogies as a vital part of the thought process, as well as critical to portraying the message at hand. Robinson's style and her unique writing abilities have made her into one of the best contemporary American authors in the United States, and maybe even in the world. Most authors who have been raised in Idaho don't have the sophistication that Marilynne Robinson has shown through her writings and artistry about word choices. She is a gifted author who deserves much more recognition. This is from a high school student in advance, so your reputation is not just limited to Iowa City. I read her speech before that, and I can assure you that it is learned, excellent, and quite instructive. Thank you.
The subject I have set myself is so large that I am at a loss where to begin. The work of restoring the reputation of John Calvin to anything resembling human and historical plausibility is vastly greater than one lecture can accomplish, or one lifetime. He and his work have been defamed, using the word advisedly, for so long and in so many ways that if one point is made in his favor, he is still held to be condemnable on 100 other grounds. People, scholars, who know nothing at all about him, not even his nationality or the century in which he lived. He was French and lived in the 16th century. Never think to doubt that he is utterly known to them in the one fact of deserving their contempt. I may seem to overstate the problem. I have met people since the subject first engaged me who seemed quite unaware of all this. The community of Calvinist scholars, whose pleasant lot it is to read other Calvinist scholars. To them, his reputation seems secure, as it does to no one else on earth, so far as I can tell. And why does this matter? Calvinism is a theology, among others, persuasive or not for reasons of culture or temperament or circumstance. But it has been given a significance, an odd sort of prominence that other theologies do not share. It is assumed to be a crucial historical datum, the source and marker of epochal change. Calvin and Calvinism are catchwords for a very influential set of cliches, which are assumed to have extraordinary descriptive and explanatory sufficiency when they are used in the context of American history, politics, economics, culture, and religion, and of course in accounting for the peculiarities of the American psyche. And it is somehow as a consequence of this odd prominence that it is not known, not consulted, not understood. There is an immense literature, popular and academic, so far as that distinction can be justified, devoted to this important work of American self-understanding, as there certainly should be. How odd, then, this huge dead spot in the middle of it all. If I were to venture one generalization about the welter of apparent controversy surrounding all these questions, I would say that it is founded on a uniform ignorance of that one thing from which so much is said to proceed, and which is supposed to exert its recalcitrant influence on our individual and national lives even now, the body of theological literature called Calvinism. The degree to which Calvin's thought is to be identified with American Puritan thought, considering the lenses of culture and circumstance it passed through in arriving at Plymouth, is in itself an interesting question. It is a question obscured by inattention to such matters as their shared understanding of the nature of the church and the sacraments, their shared emphasis on the sovereignty of God, and the similarity of Puritan social values and arrangements to the model of Geneva. In any case, they are so commonly associated by historians and others that the reputation of either is inextricably bound up in the reputation of the other. Theology is difficult, certainly, and Calvin is among the greatest theologians. That is to say, his thought is exceptionally demanding. Calvin's name and his thought are so much spoken of because his influence as a theologian is said to have been profound in the formation of Puritan New England. Those who do not understand physics generally do not venture to write histories of modern science. Surely there should be an ethic in all scholarship that would encourage one to master the essentials of a field of study, or if that is not possible, to leave it to those with a better grasp. At very least, scholarly ethics should encourage us to take a glance at a few of the crucial texts. In the matter of Calvin and Calvinism, it is clear that no such minimum standard is considered to apply. And yet they are continuously invoked as the origin of whatever any writer happens to feel has gone wrong with American culture. Now, if there is one thing we know, it is that cultures do go wrong. And we know that the margin for error narrows with every advance of technology. Yes, scrutiny and criticism of every aspect of our culture is an urgent responsibility. No, that does not mean arriving over and over again at the same pat conclusion that was already being arrived at 100 years ago. And no, that does not mean locating fault in the 17th century and so making ourselves the victims rather than the agents of our own fault and failure. It is as if we have a sort of fetish doll, a thing dressed all in moldy black and rigged up to look a very little bit like something that might once have been a human being, only bigger and very pinched and mean about the face. It would be called the Calvinist or the Puritan. And every time we get disgusted with ourselves, and truly we give ourselves grounds for disgust, we take out our fetish and thwack it around a good deal and taunt it and denounce it. And when we are done, we feel uplifted as if for once righteousness has been served. It is certainly not because I wish to discourage criticism of American culture or society or economics or anything else that I object to the way criticism of these things has tended to be done. Quite the opposite. I want the criticism to be sound, informed, and clear-eyed precisely because it is so important. At the risk of sounding Calvinist or Puritan, I am convinced that we will never take any step toward amelioration of the things about ourselves that trouble us until we acknowledge our own present, living, breathing implication in them and responsibility for them. I am convinced, furthermore, that one major fault is our unembarrassed willingness not to know, in the greatest matters, what in the world we're talking about. 10 years ago, while I was preparing to teach a seminar at the workshop on Moby Dick and pondering the theological richness of the book, it finally occurred to me to do the obvious thing, to acquaint myself with the theology with which Melville would certainly have been in conversation. So I read Calvin's Institutes. I had read enough theology in the course of my life to know what I was seeing: a splendid metaphysics, a splendid conception of human consciousness, a gallant ethics, a grand aesthetics. Not only was I struck by the vision of the Institutes itself, I was also given great new light on all the writers I love best, up to and including Charles Sanders Peirce. There is an odd tendency to say that American civilization was and is deeply influenced by Calvinism, and then to say that any specific thinker or writer had renounced Calvinism or strayed from it, the implication being that he or she had therefore escaped its influence, and that this escape is manifest in anything deep or pleasing he or she might have written. Typically knowing nothing about Calvin's theology, assuming that it must be a system of crotchets and prohibitions glowing with hellfire, they can hardly be expected to recognize its influence when they see it. It is precisely the scale of vision, the odd exploration of consciousness, and the profound experiential aesthetics that are Calvinist in Melville, Whitman, Dickinson, and their contemporaries. It is as a metaphysics, not as a set of doctrines, that Calvinism has always persuaded, and it is as a metaphysics that it has abided, immune to whatever innovation or drift or erosion occurs at the level of doctrine. So it is with all the great theologies. I did bring certain advantages to my reading of Calvin. I had done a historiographical dissertation on Shakespeare's Henry VI plays, so I was familiar with the issues and the terminology of late medieval and early Renaissance thought. And I had a sense of what the norms were in Europe at that time, having to do with crime and punishment, literacy, the treatment of the poor, constraints on thought and expression, and so on. I was also familiar with the lives of certain of Calvin's contemporaries, for example, Thomas More, who was his equal in learning and in intensity of religious conviction, and who very much exceeded him, both in political power and in the severity of his exercise of it. If More should be exculpated, and indeed he seems only to be admired, then there are no intellectually respectable grounds whatever for thinking harshly of Calvin. This is true not least in the use of polemic, which is characteristic of More as of Calvin and of every writer engaged in the intellectual battles of that disputatious age. Crucially, Calvin is a classic example of the exhaustively educated Renaissance humanist. One who does not know this cannot recognize his influence or understand the character of his thought. When Perry Miller, in the New England Mind in the 17th century, finds his Puritan clergy reading and citing the church fathers and the scholastics and the writers of classical antiquity, he is content to register surprise. It apparently does not occur to him to look into their tradition to discover why they might have been reading them. That he should be surprised would be proof enough, if proof were not ample, that this scholar of Calvinists had no acquaintance with Calvin. It is fair to wonder what he knows about the period of the Reformation itself. In his Institutes, Calvin, not surprisingly, quotes or alludes to the writings of Irenaeus 13 times, of Origen 16 times, of St. Jerome 34 times, of Augustine almost 600 times, Ambrose 40 times, Bernard of Clairvaux 51 times, Bonaventura 16 times, John Chrysostom and Pseudo-Chrysostom 50 times, Cyprian 44 times, Pope Leo I 42 times, Pope Gregory 87 times, Cicero 82 times, Horace 10 times, Plautus 9 times, Terence twice, Ovid twice, Seneca 25 times, Homer 5 times, Aristotle 16 times, Euripides once, Plato 44 times, Plutarch 4 times, and so on. He quotes or alludes to Peter Lombard 45 times and to William of Ockham 12 times. This is a short list of the patristic, classical, and scholastic writers who figure in the Institutes. All this is to say the odds are good that if one were to open to any page, one would come across some such quote or allusion. Therefore, I feel justified in suggesting that Miller did not acquaint himself even slightly with Calvin's most available and influential work before writing The New England Mind in the 17th century. Miller does characterize the Institutes, however, by way of telling us why these Puritans had to depart from his example and attend to the fathers, the classics, and the scholastics. He says the Institutes, quote, has a majestic sweep of untrammeled confidence, and he says, end quote, and he says remarkably, Calvin composed a sublime system of dogma. He sketched out the architectural framework in broad and free strokes. The ecstasy of belief made affirmation sufficient in and for itself. There was no need for elaborate props and buttresses, for cautious logic or fine-spun argumentation, end of quote. Miller never mentions that the author of the Institutes, so meticulously trained in rhetoric and law, spent his adult life continuously revising the Institutes. Miller says further that in Puritan America, quote, Calvinism could no longer remain the relatively simple dogmatism of its prophet. It needed amplification. It required concise explication, syllogistic proof, intellectual as well as spiritual focus. For this reason, according to Miller, the Puritans turned from Calvin and toward those earlier writers, for which the Institutes might in fact have served as a sort of annotated bibliography. If I am wrong, and Calvin looked for intellectual focus in the Institutes but somehow failed to find it, he apparently did not think to look for it elsewhere in Calvin's vast corpus, for example, in his dozens of volumes of commentary on the books of the Bible with their scrupulous parsing of Hebrew and Greek. There is no evidence of familiarity with Calvin in Miller's book on Jonathan Edwards, which he published 10 years later. This is true despite his saying that, quote, Puritan thinking was fundamentally so much a repetition of Luther and Calvin, and Puritans were so far from contributing any new ideas that there is reason to doubt whether a distinctly Puritan thought exists. The complex of related assumptions about Calvinism and American history demand scrutiny because they reinforce one another very powerfully, seeming to put beyond question notions which are very questionable indeed. One assumption is that something went very wrong at the inception of American history, that it went wrong in the Northern Puritan settlements, and that it went wrong because they were Puritan. Another is that something went very wrong in Western history, that an evil modernity rose up and persists, and that it had its origins in Calvinism. The association of Puritan America and Calvinism with an evil modernity is the beginning place for a great deal that is written about early New England and about American culture generally. and is at work as an unquestioned assumption everywhere. Writing on the Puritans, Andrew Delbanco says, quote, "The central question for any inquiry into the experience of these resistant emigrants, here posed by D.H. Lawrence, must simply be this: what did the Pilgrim Fathers come for when they came so gruesomely across the Black Sea?" This is, and here Delbanco continues, "This is Lawrence's own reply, which I cannot better. Oh, it was in a black spirit, a black revulsion from Europe, from the old authority of Europe, but also no more of this new humanity which followed the Renaissance, none of this new liberty which was to be so pretty in Europe. Since the whole discourse about Calvinism and its American variants proceeds as if by comparison, it is meaningless to say that one civilization is particularly pathogenic without being able to say that another civilization is less so. It is useful to consider from time to time the societies with which the Calvinists and the New Englanders are implicitly or explicitly compared. I ask you to consider, in the interest of context, the history of Europe in the modern period, or for that matter, in any earlier period, and to consider at your leisure whether the horrors of the modern age seem more a departure from that history or a continuation of its terrible momentum. D.H. Lawrence was not an educated man, so his errors ought to be forgiven, though I cannot find it in my heart to forgive the phrase, "came gruesomely." His political sympathies, however, are another matter. They were so fervently for the nationalist authoritarian movement rising in Germany at that time that the British considered Lawrence a security threat and forbade him to live on the coast, where it was feared he would signal enemy ships. Ought we really, almost a century on, to be accepting historical pronouncements from such a one as D.H. Lawrence? He continues to be quoted because he speaks his loathing so straightforwardly. He lived in the great age of loathing, just before the terrible eruption of Europe. Delbanco does not quote the place in this same essay where Lawrence, in his deep contempt, says, "Americans are just like Jews." Perhaps he has not read it. It is very useful from the point of view of context to be reminded of it. Or consider implied or direct comparison with the American South. Perhaps I should note here that much of the American polemic against Puritan tradition was part of the defense of slavery in the first instance, and then a part of the reaction against the emancipation that set in after the Civil War and continued to be expressed in various forms into the 1960s. So invidious comparison of the North with the South has been a part of the interpretation of our national life for a long time. In any case, slavery was introduced into Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, as we all know. In terms of its consequences for American civilization, that event seems like an excellent candidate for the thing that went wrong, if we are so naive as to imagine it was any single motive or event that cursed us in our cradle, so to speak. Nor is its development of a slave-based economy the only regrettable aspect of Southern history that sprang from its early colonial experience. Early Massachusetts is very commonly treated as illiberal for the pious and biblicist education it gave its children, but the education of children in that period was pious, if not always biblicist, everywhere. The real difference was in the numbers of children educated, in the availability of education. In the Laws and Liberties Concerning the Inhabitants of the Massachusetts, published in 1647, it is ordered that, quote, "where any town shall increase to the number of 100 families or householders, they shall set up a grammar school, the master thereof being able to instruct youth so far as they may be fitted for the university. And if any town neglect the performance hereof above 1 year, then every such town shall pay £5 per annum to the next such school, till they shall perform this order." In 1671, Sir William Berkeley, the British governor of Virginia, reporting to the king on the state of that colony, wrote, "I thank God there are no free schools or printing, and I hope we shall not have these 100 years. For learning has brought disobedience and heresy and sects into the world, and printing has divulged them, and libels against the best government. God keep us from both. Governor Berkeley was writing after the Restoration, and certainly referring not to the event of the Puritan Revolution only, but also to the turbulence and fractiousness that brought down the Commonwealth government in its turn. The New Englanders were, of course, equally alive to the same history, an extraordinarily painful one from their point of view, but they drew no such conclusions from it. A recent book on early New England called The Making of an American Thinking Class by Darren Staloff describes the Puritans' learned clergy with their sinister skills of textual criticism as agents of cultural domination. It was the cult of learning that led us astray, we are to believe. If they were agents of cultural domination, so are many of us here. It is true that a particular kind of education predisposes one to learn and to teach and to think in one way rather than another. And it is also true that it predisposes one to learn and to teach and to think, and then perhaps to disobey, as the governor says. It is surely cultural dominance in a thousand times bleaker and more absolute form to suppress learning and printing. How amazing that such a thing should need to be said. The New England Primer may be a quaint document, but until the period of the Civil War, there was no textbook published in the South. The terror of the recoil that might come if the enslaved people contrived to make themselves literate was no doubt a factor in this dearth of education. Another interesting light on the proper meaning of the phrase cultural domination. Yet we are forever encouraged to believe that something went terribly wrong in Massachusetts. In the back pages of an 1831 issue of the New England Journal, there is an advertisement announcing the formation of the Maine Charity School to be located at Bangor, with the purpose of educating candidates for the ministry. It says, quote, "The surrounding country is rapidly increasing in population and wealth, but extremely destitute of the means of moral and religious instruction." End of quote. In order to be supported by the foundation, students must produce evidence of indigence and good native talents. And here are the conditions of admittance. For the lowest class, that the candidate shall, in addition to a thorough knowledge of Latin and Greek grammar, be able to construe and parse correctly and fluently the first 3 books of Virgil's Aeneid in Latin and one of the evangelists in Greek, and shall